Service Teardown, HP Desktop 190-000 PC. How to replace the side panel. Removal. Lie the unit on its side. Loosen the T15 Torx head screw at the rear of the side panel that secures it to the unit. Grasp the tab at the rear of the side panel and pull it slightly backward. Lift the side panel up and away from the unit. Replacement. Note, the side panel has several tabs on its edges, which fit into slots and under the front lip of the unit. It also features a small slot on the rear edge that a lock slot on the unit slides into. Align the tabs on the side panel over the corresponding slots on the unit. Slide the side panel forward until the lock slot at the rear of the unit fits through the small slot on the rear edge of the side panel. Tighten the T15 Torx head screw to secure the side panel to the unit. How to replace the wireless LAN module. Before you begin, remove the side panel and graphics card if installed. Removal. Caution: use care when disconnecting the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN module. A damaged cable or connector can degrade desktop performance. Disconnect the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN module by grasping the connector with a small pair of needle nose pliers or tweezers. Remove the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the wireless LAN module to the motherboard and allow it to rise to the spring tension position. Grasp the wireless LAN module by the edges and pull gently to remove it. Replacement. Align the notch on the wireless LAN module with the key in the wireless LAN module slot on the motherboard. Keep the wireless LAN module at a 30-degree angle and insert it into its slot on the motherboard. Replace the P1 Phillips head screw to secure the wireless LAN module to the motherboard. Reconnect the wireless LAN antenna cable by gently pushing the connector onto its port on the wireless LAN module. Caution: use care when connecting the wireless LAN antenna cable to the wireless LAN module. A damaged cable or connector can degrade desktop performance. How to replace the front bezel. Before you begin, remove the side panel and the optical drive if installed. Removal. Pull up the 3 plastic tabs to release the front bezel from the chassis. Grasp either edge of the front bezel and pull gently backwards, away from the chassis. Remove the front bezel. Replacement. Align the 3 hooks located at the side edge of the front bezel with the 3 tabs on the chassis and push into place. Push the front bezel forward towards the chassis until the 3 plastic tabs click into place. How to replace the hard disk drive. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, and the front bezel. Removal. Disconnect the power and SATA data cables from the hard disk drive. Pull back the metal hook on the drive cage that secures the optical drive power cable. Remove the optical drive power cable from the hook and push it away from the drive cage. Remove the T15 Torx head screw that secures the drive cage to the chassis. Swing the drive cage in an upright position and lift it off of the unit. Remove the 2 T15 Torx head screws on either side of the hard disk drive that secure the hard disk drive to the drive cage. Grasp the front of the hard disk drive on either side and slide it out of the drive cage. Remove the hard disk drive and reserve the drive cage. Note: while the drive cage can support the installation of a 2.5-inch hard disk drive, this size of drive is not supported as a spare part for this desktop. Replacement. Grasp the front edges of the hard disk drive and slide it into the drive cage. Replace the two T15 Torx head screws on either side of the hard disk drive to secure the hard disk drive to the drive cage. Align the three metal tabs on the bottom edge of the drive cage to the slots on the frame of the unit. Insert the three metal tabs into their slots. Swing the drive cage down into the unit until the two metal tabs on the side of the drive cage fit into their slots on the frame of the unit. Replace the T15 Torx head screw that secures the drive cage to the chassis. Insert the optical drive power cable into the hook on the drive cage and close the hook. Reconnect the power and SATA data cables to the hard disk drive. How to replace the memory modules. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard disk drive. Note, you don't need to remove the hard disk drive from the drive cage. Removal. Detach the CPU power cable from the cable guide on the fan duct. Simultaneously, push down on the retaining lever located on each side of the memory slot to release the memory module. Remove the memory module from the memory slot on the motherboard. Replacement. Ensure the latches on either side of the memory slot are open. Align the small notch on the bottom of the memory module with the key in the memory slot on the motherboard. Firmly press the memory module into the memory slot until the retaining levers click into place and the memory module is fully seated. Route the CPU power cable through the cable guide on the fan duct. How to replace the parallel port PCIe card. Before you begin, remove the side panel. Removal. Remove the T15 Torx head screw that secures the parallel port PCIe card to the top of the expansion slot on the chassis. Gently lift the parallel port PCIe card and pull out to remove it from its slot on the motherboard. Replacement. Carefully align and push the parallel port PCIe card into its slot on the motherboard until it is fully seated. Replace the T15 Torx head screw that secures the parallel port PCIe card to the top of the expansion slot on the chassis. How to replace the fan duct. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard disk drive. Note, you don't need to remove the hard disk drive from the drive cage. Removal. Detach the CPU power cable from the cable guide on the fan duct. Simultaneously push back the retaining tab on each side of the fan duct to release it. Pull the fan duct up and out of the unit. Replacement. Align the fan duct in its position over the fan on the motherboard. Insert the fan duct and press it down firmly until the tabs click into place over the edge of the heatsink. Route the CPU power cable through the cable guide on the fan duct. How to replace the fan and heatsink assembly. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard disk drive. Note, you don't need to remove the hard disk drive from the drive cage, and the fan duct. Removal. Disconnect the system fan cable from the motherboard. Loosen the 4 T15 Torx head captive screws in a diagonal pattern to release the fan and heatsink assembly from the motherboard. Note: due to the adhesive quality of the thermal grease located between the heatsink and processor components, it may be necessary to move the fan and heatsink assembly from side to side to detach it from the motherboard. Lift the fan and heatsink assembly off of the CPU and remove it. Note: if you are reusing the fan and heatsink assembly, remove the thermal grease with an alcohol swab. Replacement. Note: replace the thermal grease before replacing the fan and heatsink assembly. The thermal grease should be replaced every time the fan and heatsink assembly is removed. Place the fan and heatsink assembly over the CPU and align the 4 T15 Torx head captive screws to the corresponding screw pillars on the motherboard. Tighten the 4 captive screws to secure the fan and heatsink assembly to the motherboard. Reconnect the system fan cable to the motherboard. How to replace the CPU. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard disk drive. Note: you don't need to remove the hard disk drive from the drive cage, the fan duct, and the fan and heatsink assembly. Removal. Gently press down the CPU load lever, and then push it to the side, away from the CPU socket, to allow it to rise to the spring-loaded position. Lift the load plate off of the socket. Grasp the edges of the CPU and carefully remove it from its socket on the motherboard. Replacement. Note: identify the golden triangle on the corner of the chip assembly and the golden triangle on the socket on the motherboard by the mark on the corner of the socket stencil. Hold the CPU over its socket in the motherboard and align the golden triangle at the corner with the corresponding triangle marked on the motherboard. Carefully place the CPU into its socket on the motherboard. Swing the load plate down onto the socket. Push the CPU load lever down and then sideways to secure the CPU. How to replace the power supply. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard disk drive. Note: you don't need to remove the hard disk drive from the drive cage, and the fan duct. Removal. Disconnect the CPU power connector from the motherboard. Detach the CPU power cable from the 2 hooks and routing channel on the chassis. Disconnect the power supply command connector from the motherboard. Press the release tab to disconnect the main power cable from the motherboard. Remove the 3 T15 Torx head screws that secure the power supply to the rear of the chassis. Press the release latch on the side of the power supply and gently pull the power supply out of the chassis. Caution: before removing the power supply, make sure there are no other cables tangled with the power supply cables. Remove the power supply. Replacement. Lower the power supply into the chassis and slide it into its position on the bottom chassis. Replace the 3 T15 Torx head screws that secure the power supply to the rear of the chassis. Reconnect the main power cable to the motherboard. Reconnect the power supply command connector to the motherboard. Route the CPU power cable through the routing channel and 2 hooks on the chassis. Reconnect the CPU power connector to the motherboard. How to replace the wireless LAN antenna. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, and the front bezel. Removal. Caution: use care when disconnecting the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN module. A damaged cable or connector can degrade desktop performance. Disconnect the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN module by grasping the connector with a small pair of needle nose pliers or tweezers. Detach the adhesive tape that secures the wireless LAN antenna to the chassis. Remove the wireless LAN antenna cable from the routing channel on the inside of the chassis. Remove the T15 Torx head screw, which secures the wireless LAN antenna to the front of the chassis. Carefully guide the wireless LAN antenna cable through the access hole on the front of the chassis and remove the wireless LAN antenna. Replacement. Guide the wireless LAN antenna cable through the hole in the front of the chassis. Align the wireless LAN antenna with the screw hole on the chassis and press down firmly. Replace the T15 Torx head screw that secures the wireless LAN antenna to the front of the chassis. Route the wireless LAN antenna cable along the routing channel on the inside of the chassis. Reattach the adhesive tape that secures the antenna to the chassis. Reconnect the wireless LAN antenna cable by gently pushing the connector onto the port on the wireless LAN module. How to replace the motherboard. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the wireless LAN module, the expansion cards if installed, the hard disk drive. Note, you don't need to remove the hard disk drive from the drive cage, the fan duct, the fan and heatsink assembly, and the CPU. Removal. Disconnect the following from the motherboard: CPU power cable, main power cable, power supply command cable, SATA power cable, SATA data cable. Remove the 9 T15 Torx head screws that secure the motherboard to the chassis. Partially lift the front of the motherboard upwards. Carefully slide the motherboard to the front of the chassis to release the connectors from the rear I/O panel. Lift the rear edge of the motherboard and carefully pull it out of the chassis. Replacement. Before replacing the motherboard, you must first restore the CMOS factory settings. Remove the RTC battery from its socket on the motherboard. Wait 30 seconds. Replace the RTC battery to its socket on the motherboard. CMOS factory settings are now reset. Grasp the motherboard by the edges and carefully insert the front edge of the motherboard at an angle to the chassis. Lower the motherboard onto the chassis and align it with the metal tabs on the chassis. Tow the rear I/O connectors into the rear I/O panel until the motherboard sits snugly in place. Replace the 9 T15 Torx head screws to secure the motherboard to the chassis. Reconnect all of the connectors to the motherboard. Note, after reassembling the desktop, you need to enter System BIOS and reset the time and date settings in BIOS.